Look at your hands. Do you remember the very first time you held a paycheck? Not a direct deposit notification on a screen, but a real paper check. It was probably light blue or green, printed with a typewriter font, and it had your name on it. Maybe you earned it bagging groceries at the A&P, flipping burgers at a diner, or sweeping floors at the local hardware store. Do you remember the number on that check? If you were working in 1964, the federal minimum wage was $1.25 an hour. To a kid today, that sounds like a joke. They spend more than that on a single song download. But you and I know the truth. That $1.25 wasn't a joke, it was a promise. It was a contract between America and its workers that said, if you give us your time, we will give you a life. Let's do the math that modern economists try to ignore. If you worked full-time 40 hours a week at minimum wage in 1964, you brought home $50 a week, $200 a month. Today, $200 might pay for your internet and cell phone bill, and you'd have nothing left for food. But back then, that $200 was a fortress. Imagine walking into a bank on a Friday afternoon. The floor is marble. The air smells like polished brass and old paper. It's quiet, respectful. You hand your check to the teller behind the metal bars. She knows you. She stamps your passbook, thump thump, and hands you cash, real cash, silver certificates. You walk out onto Main Street. You are 18 or 19 years old. You have no college debt because you didn't need a degree to get started. You have money in your pocket. And the most incredible thing is what you could do with it. You didn't just buy bubble gum and comic books. You could actually look for an apartment. That's right. On minimum wage, a single person could rent a decent, clean one-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood. Rent in many cities was around $50 or $60 a month. That's just 1 week of work. The rule of thumb was that rent should be 1 week's pay. And it worked. You worked 1 week for a roof over your head, and the other 3 weeks were for food, clothes, a car, and savings. Today, in most American cities, you would have to work 3 or 4 weeks at minimum wage just to pay the rent on a studio apartment. The math is broken. But back then, the math was simple. It was honest. We aren't talking about getting rich. We are talking about dignity. The minimum wage wasn't designed to be pocket money for teenagers living in their parents' basement. It was designed, as President Roosevelt said, to be a living wage, a wage that allowed you to stand on your own 2 feet. And the feeling of independence that gave us. It was intoxicating. You weren't terrified of the future. You weren't drowning in anxiety. You knew that if you showed up and did the job, the system worked for you. Let's look at what that $50 a week actually bought at the grocery store and the car lot, because the comparison will make you angry. So, you paid your landlord. You handed over 1 week's pay for a safe, warm place to live. In today's world, that landlord would probably ask for a credit check, a background check, and a 3-month deposit. Back then, a handshake and cash were usually enough. Now, you still have 3 weeks of wages left in your pocket. That's about $150. Let's see how far that stretches. Let's go to the grocery store. Food is the fuel of labor, and in 1964, fuel was cheap. You walk into the supermarket. You aren't buying organic, gluten-free, artisanal kale chips. You are buying real food. A loaf of white bread was 21 cents. A gallon of milk was under $1. A pound of hamburger meat was 35 cents. Think about that. On 1 hour of minimum wage work, $1.25, you could buy 3 pounds of beef. Today, you have to work an hour just to buy a single fast food cheeseburger that barely has any meat in it. The ratio is completely broken. You could fill a shopping cart with eggs, bacon, coffee, potatoes, and vegetables for $10 or $12. That fed you for the entire week. And it wasn't processed garbage, it was ingredients. You cooked, you sat down, you ate, so rent is paid, food is bought. and you still have over $100 left in your pocket for the month. Now, look at how we dressed. Look at photos of crowds in the 1960s, at a baseball game, or walking down the street. Everyone looks put together. Even people with low incomes wore collared shirts tucked in. They wore leather shoes, not plastic flip-flops. Why? Because quality was affordable. You could walk into a department store and buy a pair of Levi's jeans, thick American denim, that would last you 5 years, for $5. That's 4 hours of work at minimum wage. Today, a good pair of jeans costs $50 or $60. That's nearly a full day of work for a kid on minimum wage now. And shoes? A pair of sturdy leather work boots might cost you $10 or $15. You took care of them, you polished them. If the heel wore out, you didn't throw them in the trash. You went to the cobbler and had them resoled for $1. We lived in a society of maintenance, not disposal. And then there were the bills, or rather the lack of them. You didn't have a distinct bill for internet, a bill for streaming services, a bill for a smartphone data plan, or a monthly subscription for cloud storage. You had electricity, maybe gas, and a phone bill if you were fancy. That's it. The electric bill for a small apartment was maybe $5. The basics were covered so easily that you didn't lie awake at night wondering if the lights would get cut off. You slept soundly. So here is the tally. You worked a lowly minimum wage job, but you have a roof. You have a fridge full of food. You have clothes on your back, and you haven't even touched half of your monthly income yet. You have surplus. You have breathing room. This is the part that modern economists don't put in their spreadsheets. They talk about inflation adjustments, but they forget the stress factor. In 1964, a minimum wage worker could save money. Today, a minimum wage worker is drowning in debt before they even get their first paycheck. But having money left over meant you could do something else, something that defines the American experience. You could move. You could buy wheels. Let's talk about how a kid flipping burgers could afford a car that is now considered a collector's item. Let's talk about wheels. Today, if you make minimum wage, you are likely taking the bus, walking, or begging for a ride. Buying a car feels impossible when a used Honda Civic with 200,000 miles costs $5,000. But in 1964, the Beta car was a rite of passage, and it was affordable. You could walk onto a used car lot with $300 cash, that's just 6 weeks of saving your surplus money, and drive off in a 1957 Chevy or a Ford Falcon. It wasn't brand new. It might have had a dent in the fender. It probably smelled like oil and old upholstery. But it was yours. No bank loan, no monthly payments. You held the title in your hand, and feeding that beast didn't bankrupt you. Gas was 30 cents a gallon. You could pull into a station, hand the attendant $1, and get enough gas to cruise all night long. Think about that. 1 hour of work at minimum wage bought you 4 gallons of gas. Today, 1 hour of minimum wage buys you maybe 2 gallons if you are lucky. The purchasing power of your time has been cut in half. Having a car changed everything. It meant you weren't stuck. If you didn't like your job in town, you could drive to the next town over and apply at the factory there. It gave you bargaining power. It gave you freedom. And what did we do with that freedom? We went out. We didn't sit at home watching Netflix because we couldn't afford to leave the house. We lived. Saturday night meant something. You could take a date to the movies. A ticket cost less than $1. Popcorn was $0.25. You could treat your girl to a movie, snacks, and a burger afterwards, and the whole evening cost you maybe $3 or $4. That is 3 hours of work. Today, a dinner and a movie date can easily cost $100. That's an entire day or two of labor for a kid starting out. Or maybe you went bowling. Bowling alleys were the social clubs of the working class. You joined a league. You bought your own ball. It was cheap entertainment that got you out of the house and among friends. We were social creatures. We had community. And let's not forget the drive-in. You piled 5 friends into that $300 car, some of them hiding under a blanket in the back to sneak in, and you spent the whole night watching double features under the stars. The point is this: minimum wage didn't just cover survival. It covered living. It allowed for a social life. It allowed for joy. You didn't feel like a prisoner of your own poverty. You felt like a participant in American life. But perhaps the most shocking thing you could buy with minimum wage wasn't a car or a movie ticket. It was an education. Let's look at how a summer job used to pay for a college degree, something that sounds like absolute science fiction today. If you worked a minimum wage job for just 12 weeks during the summer, flipping burgers, lifeguarding at the local pool, or painting fences, you would earn $600. That means you could pay your entire year's tuition, pay for your books, buy a few beers on the weekend, and still have money left over. You didn't need a student loan. You didn't need to sign your soul away to a bank for the next 20 years. You graduated at 22 years old with a degree in one hand and zero debt in the other. You started the race of life at the starting line, not 50 yards behind in a hole of debt. Today, students are graduating with mortgages without the house. They carry $50, $80, $100,000 in debt before they even earn their first paycheck. Back then, minimum wage was a stepping stone, not a trap. It allowed you to climb. And because you weren't drowning in debt, you could save. Even on a humble wage, you could put away $10 or $20 a month. That doesn't sound like much, but remember, $20 was a week's worth of groceries. It added up. Young men would save up for a diamond ring. Say a modest one, sure, but they paid cash for it. They didn't put it on a credit card with 20% interest. They saved, they bought it, and they proposed. People got married younger, often at 20 or 21, because they could afford to start a life together. They didn't have to wait until they were 35 to feel financially secure. There was a culture of thrift. We used layaway. We used Christmas clubs at the bank. Do you remember Christmas clubs? You put a little money in every week, and by December you had a check to buy presents. We didn't spend money. We didn't have to impress people we didn't like. The minimum wage lifestyle wasn't glamorous. You weren't flying to Europe or driving a Cadillac, but it was dignified. It was stable. You had a floor under your feet, not a trap door. You knew that if you worked hard, you wouldn't starve, you wouldn't be homeless, and you could build a future. But somewhere along the way, that contract was broken. The cost of everything, housing, healthcare, education, skyrocketed, while the value of our labor stayed flat. We went from a nation of owners to a nation of debtors. As we head into our final thoughts, we need to ask the hard question: what did we lose when we lost the value of our dollar? And is there any way to get that feeling back? So, we come to the end of our journey. We've looked at the grocery receipts, the rent checks, the tuition bills, and the price of a gallon of gas. The numbers don't lie. $1.25 an hour in 1964 wasn't just a number. It was a key that unlocked a dignified life. Today, economists will show you charts about inflation and purchasing power parity. They will try to tell you that televisions are cheaper now, or that we have better medicine. And that may be true. But you can't live inside a flat-screen TV. You can't eat an iPhone. What we lost is something you can't put on a chart. We lost the feeling of safety. Back then, if you fell to the bottom of the economic ladder, if you had to take that minimum wage job, you didn't hit concrete. You hit a trampoline. You could bounce back. You could survive, save, and climb back up. Today, the bottom is a trap door that opens into a free fall. We lived in a time when the American dream wasn't about becoming a billionaire. It was about being okay. It was about working 40 hours, coming home to a warm house, eating a good meal, and sleeping without a knot of anxiety in your stomach. We were rich in security. We were rich in hope. Look at the faces in the old photographs one last time. They aren't stressed. They aren't looking at their phones, terrified of the next bill. They are looking forward. They built the highways we drive on. They built the schools our grandkids go to. And they did it all on wages that, by today's standards seem impossible. Maybe we can't bring back the 30-cent gas or the $50 rent. The world has moved on, but we can keep the memory alive. We can remind the younger generation that it wasn't always this hard, that there was a time when an honest day's work guaranteed an honest life. That is the legacy of the 1960s. It stands as a monument to what is possible when an economy works for the people, not just for the corporations. I want to thank you for taking this walk through history with me. It's important that we don't let these facts disappear. Now I have a favor to ask. I want to build a living archive in the comment section below. I want you to tell me, what was your very first job? How much was your first paycheck? And what did you buy with it? Did you buy a car? Did you help your parents with rent? Did you buy a record player? Leave your story below. I read every single one of them. If this video brought back memories, please click the like button. It helps us share this truth with more people. And if you want to keep exploring the golden age of America, make sure to subscribe to American Echoes. We have many more stories to tell. Until next time, keep the memories alive.